There they are, son, buffalo.
I didn't think there were so many of them.
In your grandfather's time, the buffalo herd used to reach as far as you can see, all over the Great Plains. When your grandfather was a boy, the government was making agreements or treaties with our people. By the treaties, they gave up most of their great lands for white men to settle on. Our people were supposed to live in the smaller areas called reservations. They found they could not live their old life on the reservation, and some of them kept going far off onto the open plains to hunt buffalo and to live as they wanted to. But the United States Army forced them to return to the reservation. 72 warriors, including your grandfather, were punished and sent to prison in a far distant fortress called Fort Marion at St. Augustine, Florida. In the 3 years at Fort Marion and afterwards at Hampton and Carlisle Institutes in the East, 26 of the younger men drew pictures showing their old life on the plains before 1875. On this camping trip, we are going to visit some of these places that they have pictured in their drawing. And I'm going to show you some of the pictures my father and some of his southern Cheyenne and Kiowa friends made and tell you about them. Then someday you can pass it on to your children and grandchildren about the old life that is nearly gone now. This is a Kiowa named Itatliu, who showed the way the buffalo herds looked then. You can see the dry plains with hardly any trees or brush growing, and the rolling country around that flat-top mesa.
Itatliu put in so many things that make the picture look real, like the cairn, the antelope, and even the prairie dog holes like the ones we've just seen.
He and the other men who drew the pictures in this book wanted to show just how they lived in the good days before they had to live on reservations. Long afterwards, when they used to come to see my father, they would tell many stories about the buffalo hunting days on the plains. This kind of land was natural pasture for buffalo. That's why this part of Oklahoma is used for livestock grazing today, except this section in the Wichita Mountains that the government set aside as a refuge for wildlife and as a place of recreation for people. In the early days, they lived in camps way out on the open plains, far away from the cities and farms of white men.
Camping, just like us. But if there weren't any stores around, where did they get their food and clothes and material to build houses?
The answer is right over there.
How could the buffalo give them all the things they needed for living?
A Kiowa man named Wohaw drew a picture giving one answer. Men hunted the buffalo and butchered them where they fell. Here they have slit the hide down the back and are cutting it loose. Now they can take the good hump meat, the ribs and the tongue. They will take all the meat their animals can carry, for meat was the principal food of the Indians on the plain. A Cheyenne showed how they cook meat at camp. The mother of the family is roasting some tender bit on a stick, while she boils more of the meat in a kettle of water. With no refrigerator, the people had to find a way to keep the meat from spoiling. They laid strips of meat over a pole to dry in the sun and in the heat of the fire. Once dry, it would keep for a long time.
And they even made clothing from the buffalo hide, didn't they?
In the early days, a man wrapped around him the heavy buffalo hide with the wool still on it as a robe, a kind of coat in cold weather. The tough rawhide made the soles of the moccasins that protected his feet from rocks and stickers. The hide was too thick for most clothing, so he used deer or elk skin for this. But all his clothes were sewed with a thread made from the sinew along the buffalo's backbone, and all his bright ornaments were sewed onto the clothing with sinew. Squint Eyes, a Cheyenne, drew this picture showing a girl tanning a hide.
I know how the buffalo gave the people shelter. The teepee is made from buffalo hides, isn't it?
Yes, and it took a lot of time to hunt out the many cow buffalo needed for it, carry the hides back to camp, tan them, and cut and sew them to the right shape. How many hides do you think it took for one teepee?
Well, if that's a buffalo hide the girl is tanning, it looks as if she would need about 14.
You're close. It took from 10 to 20 hides for one teepee, depending on the size. Teepees were used instead of permanent houses because they were like our camper here.
They could be easily taken down when the people had to move on in search of food for themselves or their horses. I can see the pegs driven in the ground to hold the teepee down. How could those little pegs hold it when the wind really blew?
Let's move on, and I'll show you something else they did for that. See that flat open space on the east side of the hills? That would be a typical camping spot in the old days, where the teepees would be sheltered from the hard west winds. Waha drew a picture of this kind of camp. Do you know why else they might have chosen this location?
Well, campers always need wood and water and food. They could get the firewood in the forest on the hills and probably find springs of water. Then there would be deer and elk and smaller forest animals to hunt.
If there were no shelter, just open plains, our people would camp in a place like this. Trees and brush were usually found along the banks of streams, and on the plains beyond were the buffalo.
The people butchering the buffalo aren't wearing clothes made from skins of animals.
You're right. The white man's goods gave them clothing more brightly colored and easier to make, so our people adopted these things as soon as they could get them. The women in the drawing are wearing cloth dresses and factory-made blankets, while the man has a robe of cloth and a calico shirt.
How did they get these things from the white men?
Your grandfather's friend, a Cheyenne named Macon Medicine, drew a picture to explain one way. A white trader's wagon train is winding its way down a steep hill like the ones around us now. He is bringing goods to trade to our people for buffalo hides at the teepee village along the top of the picture. When the people lived near a trading post, they sometimes would go there for things they wanted. Zontam the Kiowa shows us a scene at a post run by a famous white trader, John S. Evans. When our people came here to trade, they would often go a mile or two further to Fort Sill.
The army post. Can we go up there?
Most of the early forts were built around a large open field. There was a building for headquarters, some more buildings for the soldiers to live in, and the houses for the officers. This is the place from which your grandfather and the other prisoners were shipped off east to Fort Marion, Florida. Many of these are the original buildings of Fort Sill that were here when the drawings were made. Here is a very guardhouse where one of the prisoners named Whitehorse was held in chains. This is a drawing showing this fort or one like it. A soldier society is putting on a formal dance. At army posts, our people saw many things made by the white man, and they grew to wanting some of them. At one time, long, long ago, before white men came to this country, each tribe was independent and made most of the things they needed. They traded with other tribes for some things and sometimes adopted customs that they liked from their neighbors. For instance, the Omaha and Osage tribes had a dance with special costumes which the Southern Cheyennes and Kiowas adopted from them. A Cheyenne drew a picture of the Osages doing this dance. A Kiowa shows the Kiowas after they took up the dance with the same kind of costumes and haircuts and weapons as the Osages used.
So when the white people came with their trade goods, it wasn't a new thing for our people to want some of these things right away.
The white man made it easier for our people by bringing in many of the things you see in these pictures. And the people came to depend upon them instead of depending entirely on themselves. When the government placed the people on reservations, they became more dependent on white people than ever because they were forbidden to go out and search for the buffalo. The government promised to pay for the lands our people gave up by giving them every year certain articles that they needed for living on the reservation. They were called annuities. The Cheyennes had to go to Darlington, the reservation headquarters or agency, for their annuities. In this picture, we see them seated on the ground while their leaders distribute the annuity goods.
One man is delivering a kettle and a long piece of cloth, and another is bringing a kettle and an axe.
A third man is serving coffee to his people while they wait for their annuity goods. There are also guns and cups to pass out. The chief is talking to the agent for the Cheyennes, John D. Miles. The teamster drives his empty wagon away while an army officer watches to see that the annuities are given fairly. At this time, the buffalo were being killed off by the white people, and those that were left were far from the reservation. The government gave our people beef to eat, but there was never enough to keep them from being hungry. Therefore, many of our people left the reservations to hunt the buffalo in the way they had done before. From the buffalo ranged, the army drove them into the agencies, and from there the 72 warriors were sent off to prison, where some of them drew the pictures we are looking at. In this way, they were able to leave us a true picture of life in the free buffalo hunting days on the plains. There they are, son, buffalo.
I didn't think there were so many of them.
In your grandfather's time, some of them kept going far off onto the open plains to hunt buffalo and to live as they wanted to. But the United States Army forced them to return to the reservation. 72 warriors, including your grandfather, were punished and sent to prison in a far distant fortress called Fort Marion at St. Augustine, Florida. In the 3 years at Fort Marion and afterwards at Hampton and Carlisle Institutes in the East, 26 of the younger men drew pictures showing their old life on the plains before 1875. On this camping trip, we are going to visit some of these places that they have pictured in their drawing. And I'm going to show you some of the pictures my father and some of his southern Cheyenne and Kiowa friends made and tell you about them. Then someday you can pass it on to your children and grandchildren. The buffalo herd used to reach as far as you can see, all over the Great Plains. When your grandfather was a boy, the government was making agreements or treaties with our people. By the treaties, they gave up most of their great lands for white men to settle on. Our people were supposed to live in the smaller areas called reservations. They found they could not live their old life on the reservation, and some